Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Design Review Board public meeting of February 14th, 2019 is called to order. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone, as well. Please refrain from talking amongst yourselves, and please turn off or put on vibrate all cell phones at this time. If you need to talk, please leave the meeting room. Anyone who wishes to speak, including applicants, on any of the applications to be reviewed today, are asked to completely fill out one of the speaker cards provided at the table by the front door and submit it to staff. You will be called upon to speak by the chairman of the board. Anyone who wishes to be re-noticed about a particular project in the event of a return for redesign must completely fill out one of the postcards provided at the table by the front door and submit it to staff to receive notice of subsequent meetings. Current Design Review Board agendas are available by visiting our website at www.glendaleca.gov. A handout describing the procedures of the meeting, possible board decisions, and Design Review Board's appeals is available from staff. In terms of a roll call, Board Member Arzumanian.
Here.
Board Member Malikian.
Here.
Board Member Simonian is running a bit late, and Chairman Benlian.
Here.
The report regarding posting of the agenda. The agenda for this meeting was posted on the bulletin board outside City Hall at or before 5 p.m. on February 7th. Oral communications. Discussion is limited to items not a part of this agenda. I have no oral communication cards, and I do not believe any had been submitted. Which then brings us to tonight's meeting, and I would like to turn that over to Chairman Benlian.
Good evening, everyone. So we'll go ahead and start with the first item on the agenda, case PDR 1801572, 3120 Verdugo Road, and we'll go ahead and start it with the staff report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Design Review Board. Good evening, Mr. Chair and Design Review Board members. This case on the agenda is a proposal to construct a new single-family dwelling on a currently undeveloped property. The property is located at 3120 North Verdugo Road. It has an area of approximately 5,200 square feet. It slopes upwards from the street. The proposal is to construct an approximately 2,062 square foot, three-story single-family dwelling on this property with an attached two-car garage. There's an oak tree in the parkway in front of the property, and also additional oak trees on adjacent properties. The applicant has worked with our urban forester and our Public Works Engineering Division to construct the public improvements in such a way that the oak tree in the parkway will be protected. Additionally, the landscape plan has also been adjusted to take into account the preservation of the oak trees. Having said this, I'd like to go into the staff report a little bit. The property is zoned R1, floor area ratio district 2, and as I said, the proposal is for a three-story, 2,062 square foot dwelling with an attached two-car garage. The proposal complies with the design guidelines. In terms of site planning, the site planning is consistent with the design guidelines. And with respect to the massing and scale of the building is consistent with the design guidelines. The building is stepped. The lower stories are stepped forward. The upper stories are stepped backward. As the topography, consistent with the topography. With respect to the design and detailing, the building is designed in the modern style, and all the materials and the design features are consistent throughout the building. Staff's recommending approval of the project with a couple of minor conditions and a consideration. The conditions are to specify decorative paving materials in the driveway, which is relatively simple. And the second condition is regarding the railing along the stairs on the north side of the property. And staff has reviewed this and has determined that the railing must be placed against the house and not freestanding at the edge of the stairs. The consideration is to emphasize the articulation of the building by providing additional siding. And we believe the building volumes are designed such that there are finite surfaces where siding can be added if necessary to improve the articulation, the visual articulation of the building. Having said this, I'd like to conclude my presentation. One additional item, we received correspondence regarding this project, and it's been distributed to the board members as well as the project applicant. Having said this, I'd like to conclude my presentation, unless there are questions from the board. The plans are available on the board behind you, and they've been distributed also with the staff report.
Thank you. Chris, any questions for staff?
No, I had a question, but I actually spoke with, and I'll talk about it regarding the height. I called and we spoke, so I'll explain my conversation when we get to the deliberations.
Okay, sounds good. So Ms. Arjumanian, any questions? Okay, so I'll go ahead and close the, open. I'll go ahead and open the public hearing, and we'll start with the applicant, Mr. Hagobian.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and board members. My name is Edward Hagobian. My address is 220 South Kenwood Street, Suite 210, Glendale, 91205. The topography of that neighborhood is in a way that maybe 3 or 4 houses, they have kind of uphill condition, but once you pass that to the left and to the right, it's flat. But however, this is a R1 zone, and we comply with all the requirements of the zoning code in this area. By the way, as you can see in the package that I have submitted, about 78 square foot of the house is a part of the garage. That's the code. If the garage is more than 500 square foot, that additional square footage goes against the house. Regarding the letter that is coming from Montecito Park Neighborhood Association, I read this today. Unfortunately, none of those comments that they have made here is true. Like 30%, dropping 30% from 40% floor area ratio, that is not for R1 zone, that's for R1R zone, not R1 zone. That's one thing. The other thing, that the way they calculate the slope is not the way we do, or with the way it is required by a special formula that we calculate. And however, they came up with 50%, ours is 44.63%, which is more accurate. Then they are talking about apartment zone heights, and this has nothing to do with that. This is a residential zone. Other than that, this is an uphill lot, and we try to design in a way that it complies with the code. And I would like to have a colored print of the house compared to house next to that. I would like to.
You can hand it to staff.
Height of our house is.
You need to speak in
You're
the
going to need to
microphone.
speak into the microphone, so if you don't mind just showing.
The height of.
You can talk over it. You want to keep it? You can speak there and keep it.
Upper level height, which is the highest point of the house, is this black line that we are showing here compared to next door house. That is the zero of that house. It starts from there.
Thank you.
Maybe Mr. Malikian has a question regarding the height. The height is being calculated from where the dirt touches the sides of the garage. And the height limit in that case will be 25 feet, which we comply with that 25 feet.
Yeah, and so maybe I can bring my question up with my conversation that I had with Chris. So my question was, how do we determine the height? And it was kind of a interesting conversation because I guess there is a definition section that precludes the doors and openings when they're excavated. In this case, the garage. I thought that you would measure from the garage door. That's where the entire building is. A 3-story building. You technically need to measure it from there. What I was told was that you don't measure that because that door is only used for an opening. And my conversation was, okay, then what about the walls next to it? And what about the rest? And I said, well, that's not how we determine that. And kind of interesting because we've seen projects, many projects in the past, and that's not how we were told. And this time it's being interpreted differently. So that's why I was kind of, and so based on that, because I was measuring almost 29 and a half feet from the garage level. And based on what after my conversation, that then it is at 25 foot.
So other than that, I don't have any specific comments. If you have any questions, I will be ready to answer.
Any questions for the applicant? No, I don't. Thank you.
One more thing I forgot to mention that in this letter that is coming from Montecito Park neighborhood, average house in this 300-foot linear foot is 2,272 square foot. And our house, including the garage, is under that. So there are houses, there is a house of 4,000 square foot, another one 2,500 square foot, another one 2,700 square foot, 2,200 square foot. So this is not the biggest house. This is even.
We got the point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next speaker, Kenton Harris.
Good evening, Chairman and Board. First, I'd like to apologize for my appearance. I came from work, so really the only.
I'm
Just
sorry.
state your name.
Oh, yep. Sorry, my name is Kenton Harris. I'm the owner of the land at 3120 North Verdugo Road. I guess really the only thing I wanted to say that I guess that there is a lot of concern by neighbors, other property owners within Glendale, et cetera, of developers versus people building their own homes for them to live in. And I just wanted to say that this is absolutely a home that I plan on living in for the remainder, at least, of my working career. I'm 35 years old. I plan to work for another 30 years. So I recently got engaged. My fiance behind me. We planned for it to be our family home for a very long time. So just wanted to I guess make that known to everybody. I grew up in North Glendale, Montrose area. I went to Crescenta Valley High School. Want my kids to go to Crescenta Valley High School, etc. So that is in fact why I picked this this project. And I guess if you guys have any questions for me.
Any questions for the owner? No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Thomas Hendricks.
Chairman, board, and staff, thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. I believe you have seen the document we submitted a day or so ago. I'm the president of the Montecito Park Neighborhood Association. We've been in existence working with the city to maintain property values and quality of life in Montecito Park since the 60s. We've reviewed this project and we believe that it should not be built in its present form. We do believe that housing should be built as infill on smaller lots in Glendale as it become more rare. The problem is that the floor area ratio of nearly 0.4 per the design exceeds the 0.3 limit, which the table 30.11-B says for lots with an original slope greater than 40%, the floor area ratio shall be limited to 0.3. The slope, the original slope of this lot as it now sits, is essentially 0.5, which is substantially greater than the 0.4. Therefore, floor area ratios greater than 0.3 are not appropriate for this property. So it's simply too big with respect to coverage of the lot. Secondly, although it's not directly applicable to an R1 District 2 property, other sections of the code for narrow lots, in fact specifically for a lot with a width of less than 40 feet, the height is limited to 2 stories. So you look into our neighborhood, we do not have 3-story houses. The higher density thing for small lots is to prevent overbearing structures. So if this house were built at 3, and I did not bring photographs of the story poles, you look at it, it's like overbearing. So our recommendation is that the floor area ratio be limited to 0.3 and the height be limited to 2 stories. Are there questions regarding?
Noted. Thank you. Any questions from the? Thank you.
And the slope is measured correctly. It's vertical over horizontal run.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does the staff have any comments they need to make?
If I may address
Go ahead.
some of the points in this letter. Very briefly, the first item is regarding floor area ratio and the resulting allowable and the resulting floor area. The argument that the floor area ratio should be reduced because of the slope of the property, that applies only in a different zone, not in this particular zone. So in this zone, there is no reduction in allowable floor area based on the slope.
Okay, thank you.
In this case, it's 40% of the lot area. The second point is regarding the slope of the property. In this letter, the slope was measured between the lowest point of the property and the highest point. In our zoning code, there's a definition for average current slope. That's how slope is measured. It takes into account the surface of the land, not just the highest and the lowest points. It takes into account contour lines and the length of contour lines at 2 foot intervals. So the slope of the property based on that, based on our GIS maps, is less than 50%, not more. And the third point is regarding the height, which we've briefly discussed already. Height, when there's excavation for doors, height is not measured from that point. Height is measured from the adjacent surface level, the main surface, ground surface, and that's a finished surface, a ground surface. And in this case, the height complies.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Hagobian, do you want to come up for rebuttal?
I don't have much to say except that this house is not the biggest house, is even smaller than the average of this neighborhood. And we shouldn't compare this house to 3 lots towards the west because, as I said, the contour in those lots are completely different. They are flat.
We understand.
And we are complying to all the requirements of the code.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll go ahead and close the public hearing and no. Do you want to just give it to staff?
Thank you.
This is the city, this is zone R1, this is the state regarding.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's not to say that it does not apply in R1 zone. If it's here before you, please show the board that
Yes.
it's right here in black and white.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Henderson. We will discuss this matter, and it's actually, the project zone is R1, so if you read this table, it is the last table. It's this one.
R1.
Correct.
This is the full width.
Correct. So it's this one right here. This one does not apply. So we'll
So
discuss
we,
this
we,
matter
we
after.
got
We'll
it.
point this out, but thank you.
We'll go ahead and close the public comments and we'll start the deliberation. You want to start us off, Mr. Malikian?
Sure. So, when I looked at the project, so the first thing that I was looking at is the how I remember there was a project that came in front of us years ago. This is like about 10 years ago, and one of the concerns that we had was that the project that was being proposed in this particular lot, the way that they were proposing, it wasn't a large project. It was just looked big because of the contour, because of the way it is, because of the narrowness and everything. So I started looking at this in a context, and Mr. Hagopian, when he does the project, I mean, he knows the code and he knows everything. So that's why I was like looking through this and trying to find out how he came up with this. And one of the questions that I came up was, and I called Chris regarding the height. It was a very interesting, finding for me. So the question comes that this is an R1 zone. So in an R1 zone, typically you have a flat land, small. It's not a hillside. It's not a, it's not a contour typically. So when they came up with the codes, and they assume that, when you're in an R1R, it's in a hillside, and, in this case, it is a hillside. So by looking at this as a hillside, and they've addressed the stepping back as much as they could, the result of the hillside, we're ending up with a 17-foot wall, which is a 15-foot retaining plus another freeboard, and it's about, I want to say, about 7 feet. The tallest portion of that retaining wall behind is above the roof line or the parapet line of the. So kind of did the numbers there. So it's creating this huge retaining wall in the back, and this small little 5,000 square foot parcel. And it brought me back to the project that we were looking at a couple of weeks or a month ago in the Adams Hill area, and how that great design of a project was being fitted in, tried to fit in this long and narrow. And I started comparing this and trying to understand how we should look at this. A 3-story is probably a rare site in the I live in the neighborhood, not in that area, but it's in the Spar Heights area, so we hardly see a 3-story building being proposed. So it's been a kind of an interesting process for me to look at this and how to address this, knowing that the zoning meets all the zoning requirement, but yet I need to look at this as being proposed in a hillside, but I can't use the hillside guidelines to address this, but they are using parts of it, which is the stepping of the building itself. So they're basically picking the different parts of the hillside and trying to put in, but then, if they're not, and so I'm kind of in the middle, trying to understand how to address this. I mean, the building looks fine, it's simple, minimal. It has the articulations that you would see. I agree with staff that a little bit more softer material rather than a stucco box, that it will help. And I think it needs to be taken a little bit further as far as softening the material in the box and everything else. The consistency of the railings and the fence and all that to me is on the side, on the south side, it kind of blocking the entire project with this wrought iron fence, whereas on the left side it's much more simpler. But the biggest question for me is the height and the 3-story. That's been the biggest challenge for me. To how do I look at this? I understand that it meets the code. I understand that it meets all the heights and everything. I understand that we need to have that 15-foot retaining wall, and you know, there are other options like creating this impact wall and getting rid of the backyard and moving the retaining wall against and possibly pushing the building back and creating a backyard or the front yard, I guess, on the rooftop. So on the upper levels. So there's those options, but being in the back and when I drove by it, the flags that were put up, it was kind of deceiving because it just showed a square box, but it wasn't a square box. It's a stepping. So I'm not sure at what level they cut off and where they actually put the flag points in. It would have been nice also, being that it's such a small and it's visible from both sides, that where the retaining wall points were on the field, on the side, so we can actually see how far back it goes. It seems like it's like most of the land is being cut out, and I don't even know how much grading this. Does it say anywhere? Let's see. How much of a grading are we, Chris? Do you know?
The staff know.
Quantity?
I'm looking it up. Perhaps we can ask the architect.
We can ask the architect.
So, I mean, in general, I think, you know, he's meeting all the codes, everything, but in overall, it's just more of an aesthetic question for me. So I'm going to leave it as that and see what you guys think and what you guys say, and
Okay.
we take it from there.
Sounds good. Ms. Arzumanian?
Yeah, thank you. So, it is true. It is meeting all the codes and the guidelines of the zone. And I think me reviewing the project is just, that's what I thought. You know, I mean, it meets the guidelines. However, when you look at it, it does look to me a boxy and a little bit, you know, the whole 3-story. You don't see it in the neighborhood when you drive by, and it's just, that's what I sort of, that was my point when I reviewed it. It's just the whole the aesthetic of it, and it is the boxiness of it. But when you look at it, it's just, I'm not sure if, I mean, the garage cannot be moved. It's there, right? So maybe it can come down a little bit, but there's no room. So if just, I'm really not sure if there's any sort of any room to play around with the design to lower the height or do something so it at least has a appearance of lower height that, you know, we can achieve. I'm really, not sure, but we can discuss that.
That's
after.
very good. Okay. Okay, so thank you, Ms. Arzumanian. Thank you, Mr. Malikian. So when I initially looked at the package and started reviewing the design, I had similar concerns that Mr. Malikian had brought up about certain elements and meeting the code. And knowing that this is Mr. Hagopian design, and he's the code expert, there's no way he's going to be submitting something that's not going to meet the code. And after staff explained basically how they came up with the height limit, because that's the part that I didn't fully understand as well. So based on, again, I'm looking at this lot, and I think Mr. Malikian has a really good point about the size of the lot. There isn't much you can do with a lot like this, and your hands are kind of tied. I mean, the only thing that you could do is just basically build a smaller house. I mean, Mr. Hagopian did his best to present something that's not very impactful. He stepped it out. He went with the contours. He tried to blend it with the hillside in the back. So I'm fine with that. I'm fine with the style. I think I'm fine with the finishes. I agree with staff. A softer material will improve will improve this specific design dramatically because it'll just help soften that mass. But again, it meets for me the biggest thing, meeting all the codes. You're not asking for any variance. Again, the size, it's a modest house. 2,500 square feet is not a mansion by any means, but maybe for this lot it's just a little too big. So I'm kind of in the same spot that Mr. Malikian is at. I think I can approve it with staff conditions, and maybe we add the condition, maybe just to like soften the mass a little bit and reduce it a little, maybe reduce the square footage a bit, just to make it fit better. But other than that, I think it's a simple, straightforward design that can work. It's just a tough lot.
It's just the result of the building based on what the code has generated.
Yeah.
The setbacks are code.
Yeah.
The height is being manipulated by the code exceptions. So everything that code gives you and exceptions have been used to generate this building,
Yeah.
and that's the result of it. And that's why it hasn't really gone beyond that point. It's more of what you see in the front, and then the sides are. It is what it is.
It is what it is. Yeah.
So I'm honestly I'm kind of in the decisive mode. I can't really maybe staff can kind of shed light on how they looked at it and maybe that their interpretation of the design and how they favored the approval, and maybe that they can give us a little bit better understanding of how staff looked at this. So, Jay, you want to take the lead on?
Well, basically, we were in the same position that you are. It's an unusual lot with unusual zoning. We can't hold someone completely to standards that don't, that deviate from saying we've met the code. And of course, you guys always have latitude to change designs that you think need to be changed, even though they're code compliant. In this case, we kind of recognize that this is what we get, and we've seen other houses similar to this on other lots, on hillside lots. We did think, through material palette changes that we could have a better product coming out of this. Just looking at it now, I wondered if some of the heaviness kind of hanging around the top parapet might be dropped to kind of just maybe have a stepping there or a softening of that corner, that edge. But that's basically, I think we recognized a lot of the limitations that you're struggling with. And
I think
not much else.
I think how I would look at this as foregoing the height issue that I have. How the massing above the garage, how it's been kind of brought up just with punched openings that, and it's been surrounded with these solid masses of volumes that it's been created. So I think by introducing some windows and maybe pulling back some of these masses of like volumes that it's been creating, like these, just like having all of this like solid wall here and here. This is the only thing that is kind of interesting. Like pulling this back and maybe that this carves into a nice softer opening there, or like creating this and maybe that this wraps around with some windows or something there. It just kind of, it feels a little bit more of a, rather than comes out of this commercial office building kind of a look, and brings some residential flavor to this, and maybe a little bit more of a, and then on the other side, when you have all these solid walls here, maybe that's some openings or something. I don't know. I mean, somehow this three-story building needs to soften up a little bit, and I don't know if it's just materials or like these like boxes that are coming out, this thing is pushed in. I don't know, maybe the window comes out forward, or
We could do something like soften that corner with a recessed section, kind of panels that wrap the corner that might be treated with the same kind of wood siding or something like that.
yeah, I think a little bit of a
think that
less
would
of a
help.
stucco like sticking out of the hill than more of a residential flavor of some softer materials maybe or
And
something.
would you like things that enhance the horizontality maybe, especially at that second, middle level?
Yeah, probably in that sense. And it is gonna be sticking out. I mean, it's literally, it's in front where the garage is on the adjacent property, and it's split building, and the one in the upper, it's two-level
Yes,
building.
the sides are gonna be
And it's
visible.
gonna go right next to the garage, so, so I don't even have a good idea as far as the context of the adjacent, like that 6-foot section that it's gonna be left between the garage and the other garage, and how's that gonna actually be dealt with? So, there's a lot of those kind of questions, and hopefully by softening the building and it will be a better view.
And I think staff started touching on that with their conditions.
I think it's a good direction. I think it needs to be taken a lot further, just material, but I think it just needs to be like, really feel like a house rather than more of a commercial building.
I think we
I
agree with.
By the way, I like the separation of the stone and the block and the base, and then the different colors, and maybe the coloring can be used as maybe not stucco painted, but it can be actually materials that are changing rather than a stucco, or so maybe that would.
Mr. Malikian, you're thinking, is that something you want to see again, or is that something that you're comfortable staff taking it?
So, I don't mind seeing it again. I don't know the result of this is gonna be, I think, if you guys wanna see it again, I'm fine. If you guys wanna, okay, let staff deal with this. And we've gone through quite a bit more than let the staff deal with that, but it's up to you guys. I'm okay with either.
What does staff prefer?
Where we've worked on projects like this with Mr. Hagopian and other architects and successfully, I think, translated your concepts. So we're ready for that if you would like us to.
Okay.
So is there any new conditions that was added?
Well,
Based
I
on
think what we could
conversation?
do, since you're not, I have a question on conditions where I think Mr. Malikian mentioned the fence along the left side. Is that actually the handrail you were talking
No, I'm talking about the southeast elevation, you wanna call it. How this wrought iron picket fencing that has been placed there is a complete different feel and look than the rest of the, and I don't know if it has to, do we need a 6-foot wrought iron fence? Is it gonna be a wood fence? Is it gonna be just a guardrail that people won't walk over? Or can it be the same material that is being, or same type that it gets used all around the property? Whereas on the opposite side, which is on the north side, you have the horizontal running cables, which is as a handrail, which I think that's the only thing that is being, you can see.
Okay, we can definitely make.
Yeah, so you can actually see it on the northeast elevation and how simple and minimal it is. And then when you turn and look at the south elevation, you have this.
Yeah, the south elevation's intense.
Yeah. So I think simplifying that railing maybe, or fence, it can be really helpful.
As an example, probably that fence on the southeast elevation, instead of the top rail being straight, it can be stepping up with the slope.
I would rather have it be consistent throughout, rather than come up with the whole stepping and other things like that.
Yeah, well, we
I
can, I think the point to the handrail on the north side looks pretty good. The big fence on the other side doesn't
Yeah.
look so good, and we'll find consistency there.
Right, and then I like the idea that you had about the height, the parapet, you know, the.
Power back on, and now everything's loading up again. So you want to just keep us posted when you're ready? Okay, thank you. Apologies, but they lost power as well, so we have to take a break.
Okay.
And because the hearing has to be live or recorded, so apologies, but they will give us.
I think we're back online, so.
Are we back?
We're back online.
Sorry. So what I was saying is, it sounds like, I think the board is basically taking the staff recommendations for conditions and also the staff consideration into effect in terms of moving the railing on the north side of the house, and making the house look less boxy and have softer materials. The board would also like to remove the vertical picket iron fence on the south side of the property and do something that's more consistent and probably better looking, that will bring all of the railings into some visual consistency. And then in terms of the redesign to soften the material palette and make it less boxy, what we usually do is kind of write into a condition that there are several ways this might be achieved, including, and I can run down the list of things I heard from the board, which gives the architect a little more latitude to kind of come up with ideas that you may not have mentioned. But we understand the spirit of where you're directing us. So among these things would be to reduce the amount of solid wall area, increase the size and or number of windows at the sides and the front, possibly including wrapping corners with windows, something that might enhance the horizontality of parts of the design, and this could be done through materials, through recesses, inset panels. We will look at the side wall. Well, actually, I'll make that a separate condition. And there was also an idea to soften the upper edge, the heaviness of some of those projecting stucco volumes, and maybe create a layering there that'll soften the appearance. And then there was, what I'll probably write as a separate condition, is to focus on the side wall of the garage adjacent to the adjoining property where there's kind of an exposed area of that wall, and make sure that that gets softened and dealt with in a similar way to what we're doing on the rest of the house. Does that sound?
I think that's, that sounds like it, so I'll go ahead and entertain a motion.
Okay, so with stated what is it, conditions and added ones, I would like the motion to approve the project.
I'll second that.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to approve with the conditions that have been discussed. Roll call. Ms. Arzumanian,
Yes.
Mr. Malakian,
Yes.
and Chairman Benlian.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Congratulations. So we'll go ahead and move to the second item on the agenda, which is design staff
don't mind,
presentation.
We would like to call Board Member Simonian to join us. He has arrived, and so if you don't,
You know where he is?
I believe he took off.
I'm sorry.
I believe he left.
No, I think he was planning to
He was
come back.
actually, he was in the conference room.
You can call him.
Let me go double check.
So if you don't mind taking a 2-minute recess?
So we'll go ahead and move to the next item on the agenda, which is the presentation of downtown specific plan. So we'll take it to staff.
Good evening, Chair and board members. Tonight we are bringing you the proposed updates to the downtown specific plan. We are looking for some of your feedback and input. And as you're aware, City Council imposed a housing moratorium last year to begin this effort to re-examine the DSP. There were many comments received from both the council and the community regarding the quality and the aesthetics of the buildings, the streetscapes, and the overall urban environment. So we were tasked with going back and looking at what could we do to improve our standards and essentially our code to obtain better results. So I'm going to turn it over to Vilia Zematitis here to give a background on how we got here, where we've been, and then we'll dig into some of the details.
Chairman Bentley and DRB board members, as just was mentioned, the purpose of today's Design Review Board meeting is to obtain your comments and feedbacks on the proposed design review, or in the DSP, the downtown specific plan that is. We prepared a staff report presentation in your packets. We have included the preliminary chapters for chapters 4, which is the urban design, chapter 5, which is open space, and chapter 7, which was the previous incentives and bonuses chapter, which has been revamped and presented to you as a community benefits chapter. We also, as noted, would just like to obtain your comments and input to then present to the City Council when we go back to Council on March the 5th for introduction. As Bradley stated, there is a development moratorium in place for all residential projects in the DSP. This was adopted by City Council back in March of 2018 and then also extended at that time. And the moratorium expires on March 23rd of, obviously next month. We are hoping to go back to City Council before the expiration of the moratorium. Since that time, we've had a number of meetings and workshops with City Council. First one being a concept workshop back in October. We then came back with preliminary concepts and designs in November. We returned to Council for an update last month on January the 29th. We also met with Council just this last Tuesday with regards to density limits and options for those density limits. So this is a plan that has consistently gotten feedback from City Council and direction. We are coming to you obviously today. We are also going to the Planning Commission this coming Tuesday at a special meeting for their recommendation and comments. And going back, like I said, mentioned to City Council on March the 5th. We have also met with various civic groups. To date, we have met with the Chamber of Commerce. We will be meeting also with the Glendale Homeowners Coordinating Council and the development, or the Downtown Glendale Association as well. We've also reached out to various renter groups and to Go Glendale, who represents 6 of the largest mixed-use and multifamily residential use projects in the downtown. In terms of council feedback, much of what we've heard is focused on 3 topics. One would be the urban design. 2 would be the streetscape standards, and the 4th would be, or third would be the open space criteria. Much of what urban design focused on would be in response to the current development conditions in the DSP, and primarily those projects along the central, feeling that many of them are boxy, single height, unarticulated. And so we have come back in response to those comments and have prepared criteria to modulate the height, to address scale and proportion, require building separations, and to essentially require higher quality building materials and to improve fenestration and design and overall. There was also quite a bit of feedback from City Council with regards to the streetscape experience, and this would be primarily along Central Avenue, that it was somewhat imposing, not pedestrian friendly. So in response to those items, we've come back and tailored criteria that would require greater sidewalk widths, additional street trees, additional amenities for an enhanced pedestrian experience. And last but not least was the open space standards, and much of this discussion focused on the open space incentive criteria that was used previously for density bonuses and height bonuses. So we have revamped those criteria to make sure that the open space that is provided in the downtown is much more activated, consolidated, and attractive and significant.
And through many of the public engagements that we've conducted with neighborhood and resident associations, we heard the same things. There were issues with design, there were issues with the scale and the form of the buildings. Not so much frustration with growth or even new residents. It was really about the design. They really wanted to see buildings that they could have civic pride in, and they wanted to see downtown have its own kind of unique identity and character. So recently, the City of Atlanta brought on a new planning commissioner, and one of the things he initially charged was that quality design is just not negotiable, that developers need to aim higher, designers need to aim higher, and so do projects. And one of the examples they used was this hotel at a primary intersection in Midtown Atlanta. And at this intersection, there are about 3 buildings from the 1920s, and this hotel that you see here is being proposed, not all that dissimilar from a lot of projects that we've seen. Large boxes, monotone color palette, underwhelming materials. Essentially, they have upped their standards and upped their requirements. And it's not necessarily to produce high design or dramatic design, but they wanted to see design that the city could be proud of and design that could be compatible with its surrounding neighbors. And as you can see, as this building is placed in its context, it's not any sort of dramatic, new, high modern design, but it's simple in its approach, and it's compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. And that's really something we've been trying to grapple with, the issue of compatibility and making sure that the designs that we are creating have human scale and relate to its surrounding environment. Another project that we have looked at, this is the Madera, and I believe it's the Madera Prominence. So a very similar name to the Madera here in Glendale. Same name, same developer. The site is a similar density, it's a similar size, similar requirements. Yet in this project, which is located in Buckhead of Atlanta, was able to obtain, you can see that corner, public open space. And if you go to the other corner, same thing. They were able to achieve large open public space. And the reason why we bring this up is because as we looked around at other cities, and in fact this same developer has 2 more projects in this city by the same name, they were able to achieve high rises, elegant, graceful, tall buildings along with the open space. So what we realized is that many of these other cities are asking and requiring for these improved standards and this improved design quality and open space, and they're obtaining it. And that's the approach that we took to the updates to the DSP, to be intentional and to be deliberate. We understood what the things were that the community wanted to see, what council wanted to see, and we explicitly state that as part of the downtown specific plan. And as we go through some of these next slides, you'll see that we've really kind of blown up these chapters. We've added a lot, essentially. And this is not to create some long, difficult process for a designer or a developer. We're not trying to create exactly identical results in every single project. What we're really trying to do is bring consistency to our applicants, to designers, to developers, so that they know what to expect when they come in. A lot of what we've heard is that the feedback that designers may receive isn't necessarily clear, and that's not necessarily the fault of those giving the feedback. It's because our standards don't explicitly state what it is that we want. And it's also to assist staff and council. And as we move past the DSP, if we can apply these sort of standards to other neighborhoods, other districts, other types of design, to our boards, our commissions, our council, so that when they're reviewing these, they have a measurable criteria to evaluate these projects against. So the first chapter, chapter 4 that we'll go through, urban design, really focuses on buildings, frontages of buildings, the overall design, massing, materials. What you see there to the left, that's the existing table of contents for chapter 4, and this is what we have created as part of this process. The way this is structured, it begins with 4.1 site planning, dealing with those large-scale elements that really influence the overall form. That includes existing uses on sites, the overall massing envelope from height and FAR to the setbacks and open space. It really kind of shape how that building can be organized on the site. And as we move through this, it drills down into detail. We start with the overall roof lines, modulation, eventually getting down to some of the information regarding signage and utilities and how that's located, to create a cohesive design and one that also fosters a good pedestrian environment, a good public realm. This is the existing height and FAR chart in the DSP, and what we were proposing is to remove the height and stories requirement. primarily because the height of the buildings does not align with the number of stories that were required. In some cases, we have 185-foot tall height allowance, but only 12 stories can fit in. I think we all know that mostly in a residential building, we're not going to see 14 to 16-foot floor-to-ceiling heights. And we did that because we wanted to create more flexibility to obtain open space and improve sidewalks. And towards the end of this, we'll run through a diagram on how that influences what happens at the public realm and how we can squeeze that kind of displaced development throughout the building. We also looked at 2 areas to raise the height, 185 feet. Currently, it's kind of a Bermuda Triangle between about 85 feet and about 100 to about 200, where developers just won't build. The return's just not there. You're switching construction types, you're changing materials, you're changing a lot of things, and until you can get that building tall enough, it just doesn't make sense to build at that height. So we've actually recommended to bring that up to 245 feet, similar to the Broadway Center A area. So currently, this is one of the recent developments in downtown Glendale, and some of the critique that we heard is, again, large, boxy buildings, a monotone material palette. It's missing the kind of nuance that creates an interesting skyline, that creates a more engaging streetscape. And one of the projects that we showed City Council to see if this might have whet their appetite in terms of what they would like to see was this building here. And what we really looked at is how this building follows as classic kind of base, middle, top proportions. That there's a different material at the base, it's solid, it creates a very definitive scale for the pedestrian realm. In this case, this building actually has an arcade as well. And as you move up the building, those materials, those fenestrations, those recesses begin to change. And then ultimately, when you get to the top of the building, it steps back. I think we all kind of know that this is something that's comfortable to the eye. This is a basic design principle, especially when we're looking at mid-rises and high-rise buildings. And council responded very well to this. Actually, if you look at the view to the right, this also looked at how we were trying to create a more engaging streetscape. So you can see a corner feature that's there. There's a new facade that's being incorporated, and there's also even a historic element. That small facade portion off to the left was a historic flower shop from the 1800s that they had built this around. So as you're walking down the street, you have this kind of regular pattern of changing facades, and it keeps the visual interest. What we came to understand from council and the community is that's one of the reasons why everyone loves brand, is that you have this constant change. Every 20, 30, 40 feet, the facades are changing, the buildings are changing. And there's no reason why we can't pursue those same kind of principles with new development and new projects. So as we kind of start at the top of the massing, we heard that the roof line height was lacking of interest. You could see in that prior example that we shown, the roof line was a pretty static kind of datum line. A lot of the projects are following that, kind of the idea that we've given the city a haircut at 55 feet and nothing really goes above that, nothing to even create visual interest. So what we've done as part of this is create some standards and some requirements, and most importantly, some options. Again, we're not trying to engineer identical results, but we can create a series of options that new projects can pursue in order to create more interest. So one of those is that we require a minimum 10-foot change every 150 feet along any roof line that is facing a primary street or any street frontage. Again, so that we break up this massing, that it feels like multiple buildings. Some of these buildings that we have are 200-300 feet long, and we need to create a scale that relates to the human environment. And you'll see how that translates to the facades as well. Another option is to step the building back. We heard a lot of critique on Central that it was becoming a canyon, and that above a certain height we could actually have these floor plates step back so it lets that breathe, again, relating to the human scale. Another was a corner feature. We heard positive feedback from some of the newer buildings that did incorporate this corner feature and how that created a gateway and how it created a sense of prominence to the building, but also that variation in roof line. And then the last is looking at height averaging. And in this case, and this may be most applicable in transition zones, is where we would allow the displacement of some building mass closer to the street, away from the residential transition area, and allow that to exceed the maximum height, provided that the entire massing itself averaged to the existing maximum height. And that was, again, to create two distinct forms. It could assist in creating a better transition to the multifamily neighborhoods to the west and to the east, but also just create more variation in the skyline. What we also looked at is how that affects the vertical, not just the horizontal roof line, but some of the facades that we have are long expanses of storefront glazing, aluminum storefront glazing. Little variation in the facade, so we're requiring major and minor modulations every 100 feet and 50 feet. And inside your document there, it lists the specific kind of depths and widths, kind of minimums that we're looking for. But again, to follow that standard, that we need to have that variation as one is moving down the street, that there's that constant change, that visual interest as you move along.
So major every 100 and minor every 50 feet?
Correct. And there's some other features that we won't go through everything tonight because it's just so much information you can see in the table of contents. But we have information regarding the setbacks at the kind of the building adjacent zone on the street frontage and how that can also align, so that we're not trying to create situations that are too difficult to achieve, but they're ones that can align with other things that we'd like to see as part of the streetscape or the building design. And then building separation. As I mentioned before, some of these buildings span up to 300 feet along the blocks. And in many cases, we do have a separation in the center of it. It's about 40 feet wide. The issue is that it never comes down to grade. And that same facade continues on for the full 300 feet. So it may look good if you're standing from far away, but if you're a pedestrian, you're still walking along that same kind of repetitive wall. So in this case, we want to see that separation brought down to grade. We want to see that building open up. It feels like two distinct buildings. It gives you a reprieve from that constant repetition that we see in those long blocks. Materials were a very major point to not only the community but council as well. There was a lot of discussion around the monotone color of materials, the fact that EFIS has been used as the predominant material. We know that's going to be used. We're in an earthquake zone. It's an efficient material to use, but it doesn't need to be the only material, and it doesn't need to only be in one color, and it also doesn't need to be used at the street level. Again, we're trying to create a human scale along the pedestrian realm, and that these lower portions of the building, up to 20 feet, need to represent that. Rather than having these 8-foot by 4-foot long large panels, to have materials that actually speak to the human scale. And that may be masonry, it could be wood, it could be aluminum panels, it could still be concrete panels, provided that they're scored appropriately. What we've asked for from applicants is not a list of specific materials to use, but rather demonstrate to us that the material that you are using can achieve a human scale. As we move up the building, again, it's still keeping some of those human scale elements, but this is where it may be appropriate for large panels, where EVIS or metal panels may come into play. And even moving up even further, are there opportunities to incorporate more glazing? Again, kind of lightening that mass, especially in the instances where we may have a building step back, so that the building doesn't have that imposing nature. Again, we're not trying to sorry, go ahead.
Just because you have that picture up there, what are we doing? I think I've seen something in the packet where the overhangs, before you could overhang over the property line, that's gone?
Correct. You will not be allowed to overhang over the property line. In fact, we'll cover it shortly, but we have expanded that entire pedestrian realm as well, and have created some requirements on where you can and can't overhang, essentially. Okay. So again, as I mentioned, we had set a number of standards on what kind of materials should be used, could be used. Really trying to increase the scale as you move up the building rather than at street level, so that we're creating a friendly pedestrian environment, one that a human can feel engaged in as they walk past. And it also that also affects frontages. We've seen a lot of the same aluminum storefront frontages that are pretty standard. But again, the reason why many people like brand is that as you walk down that, you have different storefronts. Some swing out, some swing open, some are just wide open, and the activity spills out. The idea that you can blend that private use with the public realm and it becomes more engaging, and trying to obtain that in other streets as well.
So, if I may, I'm collecting all my thoughts, and if I can, is that okay?
Yes, please.
So, what I'm hearing is brand is a great example, and that's what we want to do. But then at the other end, we're talking about setbacks and open spaces. So, and then we're talking about the massing and how it feels as you're driving down rather than the pedestrian. So what are we trying to achieve? And what is I'm kind of lost in all these different thoughts that it's being presented right now. Because if we want to do like brand, then we shouldn't have any setback. We shouldn't have any open space. It should be more of an pedestrian activities and scale to the humans and pedestrians, so that people can come and, just like brand,
Correct.
Whereas if it goes higher, then yes, I agree, it's set back and whatever. So as you're driving down, you feel much better rather than this monotone architecture. But then if we want to bring in open space, then it's not Brand. Actually, it's more of northern part of Brand, but that's more of an activity for the patrons of the building rather than pedestrians walking through, because you're not going to get people walking into someone's property and enjoying. We're not creating parks there. So that's what I'm kind of trying to understand. Where are we going with all these different?
So the focus is entirely on pedestrians. Even when we say canyon-like effect, that is how it feels in terms of the pedestrian. The fact that the buildings essentially begin to loom, and you have this kind of continuous facade, this continuous datum line, that you never have a reprieve from essentially feeling like you're not in a canyon. In terms of the references to Brand, it's not to replicate Brand by any means, and you'll see here later on that what we've actually done is develop street typologies to create kind of distinct characters in almost district-like fashion. But there are certain elements that there's no reason why we can't incorporate that in as part of it. What we've seen thus far on Central is that pretty much every commercial storefront has been the same aluminum storefront down the entire block, and that we can diversify that we can still create more engaging ones along with it. In terms of the open space, it's largely because this area does represent our best opportunity to obtain open space at the street level. Most other sites tend to be, especially along Brand or many of the others, are either built out or in some cases they're just too small to hold open space. What we actually have an opportunity within Central are a large number of large sites with high development potential where this idea that if we increase the height, reduce the stories, we can slender most of these buildings up where they do choose to go higher and obtain more ground level space. And again, towards the end, we'll kind of run through an example of how we got there.
And I think we need also to pay attention. The issue with the Central, it's not only the massing, it's more also the use, because a lot of these developments, they didn't have any retail or they didn't have anything. So they kind of closed it up to they had amenity spaces for the tenants. So you get that aluminum storefront doesn't even open to the ground level. So you create, the use itself is creating some of the issues.
And it's not to say that we want every commercial storefront to be like that, but there is an opportunity in there. There's several locations where you're starting to see restaurants fill up. There's no reason why we can't have more engaging storefronts in that. We know that we're not trying to replicate the commercial or the retail activity and the restaurant activity necessarily on Brand, but where there are opportunities, we could diversify those storefronts. But this could very well be a kind of neighborhood services kind of corridor where it is appropriate to have businesses, or maybe it's a dry cleaner, whatever it may be. But where we can, let's diversify. Let's make it a little more creative and inspiring.
Okay. Sounds good.
We also address the stoops. We wanted to see those become more engaging. In some cases of the newer developments, you were seeing these large walls that were being erected. Not only is that unsightly as you're walking along the the streetscape, it's also unsafe. It doesn't follow proper SEPTED standards. Those are hiding places. They're dark places. We wanted to see the streets become more engaging. The old principle of eyes on the street. And the townhome is always one of the best examples of that. And the most recent designs have essentially moved away from that. We won't go through all of these elements here, but there were a number of other elements we looked at as well. Canopies and balconies, in response to your question earlier, not allowing those to overhang from the street. We didn't want to see all of them tacked onto the building facade either. We wanted to see a portion of those recessed so that we don't have this kind of applied treatment. We wanted to see that interplay with the facade and the modulation, that 100 and every 50-foot kind of breaks that we would see. That may be a great place to attach some of those balconies. Planters, what we were seeing in a lot of projects is they were planning to do landscaping at grade, and then they would come back and they would put an above-grade planting box. They would often say, "Oh, we didn't know our parking garage is going to be there," but we all know where that boundary of that parking garage is going to be. And part of this, you also, if you observe, is later on in the year we will be bringing in improvements to even the submittal packets, so that we're obtaining this information early, so that applicants can't come back and say, "Well, we didn't know." No, we fleshed that out early enough so that we're, again, trying to be intentional and deliberate. Locating garage entries on alleys wherever feasible, trying to minimize those pedestrian and car conflicts, and integrating utilities and lighting into the building so we don't have as many of these standpipes that are kind of free-floating out onto the sidewalk. I'm going to turn this over to Velia now. She's going to go through the public realm, which includes the sidewalk and open space requirements.
Thank you.
Now, as part of the urban design chapter overhaul, as was mentioned, we really took a focus on the public realm, meaning the area between the curb to the building wall. And this is obviously in response to the comments we've heard from City Council and also from the public that we have uninviting, imposing sidewalk experiences, especially along Central. So there's definitely the focus on extending that public realm, and that would include wider sidewalks and parkways, requiring street trees at a closer proximity to one another, having the lighting fixtures along street frontages be at the pedestrian level. We would also be taking a look at pedestrian-oriented signage, whether it's projecting signs or wall signs at the pedestrian level. Also, re-examining intersections and how do we deal with crosswalk paving and striping and expanded sidewalk bulbs and whatnot. Also taking a look at the public art. How can we incorporate public art within the public realm so that it really truly is public art? And especially taking a look at the uses along the pedestrian realm, whether they be activated uses such as retail, outdoor restaurants, and the like. Again, we were just looking at streetscape beautification, an example of decorative paving, and crosswalks. Current downtown specific plan only has 3 types of streets in this case that were identified. One was the primary street, which would be the area in red, which would be Brand Boulevard, south of Lexington, north of Colorado. Then we also had entertainment streets, which would be what was previously known as the Maryland Arts and Entertainment District, which is now Artsock Avenue, but it still remains the Downtown Arts and Entertainment District. And last but not least was the residential portion. This is what was previously known as the East, or is currently known as the East Broadway. Prior to that, it was our very first mixed-use district. It was the commercial mixed-use and residential mixed-use back in the early 2000s. And so those would be the 3 streets that are called out in today's DSP, but it neglected to mention and identify the rest of the streets. So we have, in this case, introduced 2 additional street topologies. One would be the mixed-use commercial streets, and it would have its own development standards and criteria. Mixed-use commercial streets would be primarily along Central Avenue and would also extend at other portions along Colorado as well. And then also the mixed-use residential streets. Now, these would be the streets that essentially connect Brand with Central Avenue, so the east-west connectors. And those would be much more residentially oriented. Not to say that you can't have commercial on these streets. Those are permitted uses, but that the primary emphasis would be more of residential stoops and lobbies and a more intimate type of scale and experience on those side streets.
So Vilya, we're talking about the same zones, but with different guidelines, right?
Yes
or is it
and no. We don't have a map right now of the various districts. The districts themselves within the DSP, there are 11 of them, those are going to remain as is. So there are no changes to the actual districts in the downtown specific plan, but we've overlaid these street topologies on these districts. So the street topologies would essentially be standards and criteria for how do we address the street activity at that location. Whether it would be the transparency of windows, the spacing of storefronts, the glazing system, the street furniture, the amenities that are located. So what is the street experience going to be like at that particular location? It might be in the same zone, but for instance, I'm going to just point out the area between Orange and Central is actually known as the Orange Central District. But if you'll note that on the central side, it's a commercial mixed-use orientation with a street topology that's more focused on a commercial storefront type of interplay, whereas the area along the Orange side is essentially residential mixed use. So it would have more of a residential, more intimate flavor along the interior along Orange. Same district, but 2 different type of street topologies and intentions.
And much of that is in response to the existing kind of right-of-way width. Is that Orange actually lends itself to being of a more residential nature, such as Lexington or maybe California. But Central is already a very broad street, and it lacks the urban amenities that, say, Brand does. So that's more appropriate for those kind of commercial services and the need for the beautification that we propose in this.
The example before you on the screen would be essentially the distinctions between the different street topologies. So each street topology has its own total setback width. So there's a wider setback for commercial mixed use. There's a narrower setback for the residential streets. But there is essentially a standard for the parkway width, the sidewalk, so there'd be wider sidewalks along commercial mixed use streets, and then also what's called the building adjacent zone. Now in the building adjacent zone, you would be allowed to have either landscaping or if applicable, such as a commercial zone, street furniture, outdoor dining and seating for adjacent restaurant uses and whatnot. So each street, depending on its street topology, would have a different overall pedestrian realm and those corresponding guidelines.
So later on when we have the final version, you will identify the street and all the different setbacks that go with each one?
These are actually in the preliminary draft that you received as part of your packet. So these streets are now identified within the draft.
So these numbers are going to stay as proposed?
These are the numbers that are currently proposed by staff. And again, if you have comments, this is the time and place to hear those comments.
It's an assumption made so that these projects are going to be broad, large development projects, correct? What happens to these smaller, narrower projects that they have their lots that are 50 foot wide and they want to develop this? How does that work?
When we get to the open space section, we'll cover some of that we did create some outs for those smaller sites.
Okay.
Especially with the open space, because, yeah, if you only have a 50-foot wide lot, we actually looked at an example. We've had a few kind of tests come in, and, yeah, that did not work. We needed to make a change. In terms of actually being able to go up, though, with that removal of that stories requirement, that really allows us to be able to displace some of this area at grade, especially on the larger sites. If you're looking at these more narrow sites, the smaller ones, that's going to typically fall in maybe like a residential or a mixed-use residential street, where we're also asking for not as much space as part of that as well. But I think what we show towards the end will demonstrate how we've been able to displace it.
Again, the standards that were included in this third section of the urban design chapter specifically call out what type of frontages, what type of activities and uses you're going to have on that ground floor, the urban amenities, whether it be trash receptacles or pedestrian lighting. We would also determine what the minimum and maximum floor to ceiling height would be, as well as projections and overhangs. And as noted, Chairman Bentley, and I know that there was a question, can the buildings project over the sidewalk? In this case, the downtown specific plan, the draft plan, prohibits any type of projections over the required setback or the new sidewalk level. So by code right now, the building code is prohibiting it. Previously, projections were allowed and balconies were allowed to project into the public right of way over the front property line. That's no longer permitted by the Public Works or Building Department. And in this case, based on the extended public right-of-way and sidewalk width, the building would have to come back from that as well. But you can project over the building adjacent zone.
That would be where following the mouse here, is that above 20 feet, you'd be able to project out to the back of the sidewalk, essentially.
So in terms of which is a great segue to the open space chapter. And this would be chapter 5, which was revamped as well. On the screen, you see before you the outline of the existing chapter 5, which was covering open space and actually identified as the parks and open space. So there was much more an emphasis on parks and the network of space. We have not lost that network focus, but we've also introduced more stringent requirements for the actual publicly accessible open space on projects. And this is in response to council direction and comments we've heard from the public as well. We've had these projects before, they come in, the publicly accessible open space Well, the area is there, but it's not really attractive, it's not usable, it's not substantial. So how do we address that? So staff has presented an expanded Chapter 5, which actually has criteria for dimensions, accessibility, materials, landscaping, hardscape. So these are actually standardized criteria, whereas before there were a lot of guidelines in the DSP. This document really focuses on the actual standards, enforceable standards that give clarity to the developers, give clarity to staff, and ultimately result in meaningful open space areas.
So no longer a 6-inch by 300 feet will count.
No, we will not be having any more 2 feet by 150 to count as your publicly accessible open space. So
That's a good point, though.
it has been used in the past, no longer. The open space in this regards is going to have to be contiguous in a meaningful space, in a larger space that's actually adjacent to the public right-of-way. So you really do get a chance to feel this from the pedestrian level. It's not going to be elevated on another podium level that's not available visually or physically from the public. So there are criteria, obviously, in Chapter 5 to address those. There's also been an increase in the amount of publicly accessible open space. We've essentially doubled the required publicly accessible open space for most projects. Again, open space, publicly accessible open space depends on which district you're located and the size of your project. So the larger the project, the more publicly accessible open space. So
let me ask you a question,
Yes.
if I may. So let's say if you have a property, 7,500 square, 50 by 150 on Central or something like that, or 10,000 square feet, or whatever it is. 10% of that, assuming that it's in that smaller portion, 10% less than 10,000. So that means they have to provide 1,000 square foot of open space in that project? Is that what is being said?
If the street frontage width is 50 feet or less, no, they do not. If they're larger, yes. We did also establish that criteria based on the width of the site facing the street frontage, because, no, it doesn't make sense if it's an extremely narrow lot.
So if it is like, let's say, wider, and the
100 by 100.
100 by 100, let's say.
Correct. They
So
would have
they
to.
would have to provide 1,000 square foot of open space along the street side, so people can, and they can use that as a setback, they can do that whatever they want. So if they push the building back 10 feet, so theoretically they got their, 10 by, or 1 foot, they get their 1,000 square feet, or, sorry, 10 foot. So they get their 1,000 square foot that they need if it's a 10,000 square foot.
I think 10 foot is.
So I'm
too
trying to
small for-
understand, I just don't want them to, I don't want public to hear and designers to look at this and kind of look at this and find a way, like previous project, and find the codes and manipulate and bring what's, it meets the code,
Yep.
it is what, so,
It has to be theory minimum, so
right,
you would take it.
exactly.
if you-
It has
Correct.
to be substantial usable space, correct?
Yes.
And when we approached this, actually, the example we used with City Council, I kind of wish we would have brought it here, was a built example on how they were able to essentially amass about 8,000 square feet of publicly accessible open space, but it was mainly just planting strips in a small concrete pad. And we used that example, and we're able to essentially recreate that exact same building with a central space. And then that's where we begin to derive, and really we'll go through in just a moment, these minimum dimensions, minimum square footage that they have to meet, so that they can't cheat us on that, essentially.
So, and then my next question is that, let's say if that open space is created, is the intent for public that as they're walking on the sidewalk, they can come and use on someone's private property? Is that what we're trying to do?
Correct.
Is it
It could be
more
a
of-
place where they have lunch, they read a book. It could be a number of things. What we're also trying to do is improve the design standards, so it's not just a concrete paved area, that it's actually is a desirable place to be used. Part of those standards, and actually you can see here towards the bottom of this slide, is to also have the SEPTEB standards in there so that we do have safety involved, because we know that, yes, it could be used inappropriate after hours. A number of things could happen, but to design it accordingly.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, CPTED, that has been previously mentioned several times, CPTED stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design Standards. So that is what we're referring to when we talk about CPTED standards. But back to the specific development standards, and we have development standards for the publicly accessible open spaces provided in plazas and courtyards, and separate standards for the paseos. So the slide before you has an example of what would be found for the plazas and courtyards. Plazas and courtyards now would have a minimum overall area of 1,200 square feet, and the minimum dimensions would be 30 by 40. Previously, there was a 20-foot minimum requirement, and it was somewhat ambiguous. There was quite a bit of conversation and discussions in regards, well, 20 by 20, but can you have the rest of your publicly accessible open space in a 5-foot setback along the building edge? In this case, the criteria is really explicit. Minimum 1,200 square feet, minimum 30 by 40. If the publicly accessible open space is less than that as required by code, it has to be somewhat in a square format, but it has to be provided on site. So it might not have to be 1,200 square feet. For instance, if you have an 800 square foot minimum publicly accessible open space for a smaller project, that minimum 800 square feet is going to have to be essentially in a 20 by 40, whatever the equivalent would be for somewhat of a rectangular, as close to a square as possible. The criteria also includes a number of trees for every so many square feet of lot area or courtyard area, raised planters, concrete paving. Not more than 25% of those plazas and courtyards can have just standard concrete, so definitely a refocus on decorative paving, decorative materials, high quality. There's, as was mentioned, planters. Planters can only make up 25% of the required landscaping on site. The rest of the landscaping has to be at grade. So if you have to depress the parking garage underneath, that is what will have to be done, and that's going to have to be addressed at the beginning of the project, at the planning stage, not at the very end, because there are also guidelines as if during construction things change and unfortunately they have to provide planners, well, that's not going to be allowed anymore. It really is a focus on you need to do your due diligence ahead of time when you're doing the planning stages and working with planning staff to make sure that these guidelines are met.
So, if I may, just a comment, my thought as a board member. When I appreciate the specific sizes as far as one tree for every 600 and 25% of open or, landscape area or 10% of open area. But when we give a specific size of rectangular or square open space, aren't we kind of limiting the creativity of designers, landscape architects, of, maybe they do want to have an organic flow of elements that come in and go out, and parts of it become more creative, and it works with their design, and it works. And so if we see that, then it's like, no, you don't have a 30 by 40, it's not square, or it's not rectangular. So is it something that we want to do to give that kind of a specific limitation?
The 30 by 40 is essentially somewhat of a rectangle to meet the minimum area. We've had in the past, and this is the problem that we've had with the current DSP, is that there was a 20-foot width length type of criteria. Unfortunately, individuals took advantage of that. They provided a 20 by 20 foot, what they considered a plaza area, which is 400 square feet, and then utilized the rest of it in an elongated setback. So by requiring from the beginning a larger, more meaningful, publicly accessible open space, that is to essentially address the direction that we are going to try to create more meaningful, publicly accessible open spaces along the downtown streetscapes, and not just token setbacks. And that 30 by 40 at this point in time, those are the type of standards that we have proposed to make it more meaningful. Many of the projects in downtown, when we analyzed them, they were They were essentially proposed and built with publicly accessible open space that ranged pretty much in the 1,800 to 2,500 square feet. So this would definitely be in line and a little bit greater, or
But what I'm trying to say
Than what
is,
is existing.
if we are giving them parameters and allow them to be creative, rather than boxing them in, wouldn't it be better if we just say a minimum of 30-foot dimension in any direction, and they have a minimum of 1,200 square feet, but they do need a 30-foot section in that, and let them design the rest, rather than they may come back and then, a shape, but, they have so they don't come back to us and say, here's a square box and this is it. And we're just, you just want them to be a little bit more free about being creative.
Mr. Malikian, I think you make a really good point, but to staff's defense, I think they're trying to get away from the one dimension, because then you can put 30 foot by 2 feet and then meet the rest of the square footage somewhere else. So maybe we can do it with one dimension and have that condition where it has to be like one continuous place.
It has to be continuous and not just separated in different spaces, but.
I think the point that you make is actually very good, and this is something that we can probably address in the text. But I see what you're saying is that my width at one point needs to be 30, my depth needs to be 40, but it doesn't need to necessarily square up. Maybe you want to do a curvilinear building facing on there. Maybe you want to chamfer that corner. And I think we can tweak that with just a number of words, but that is a good point, because we don't want them to just rubber stamp a square every 200 feet along the street.
And I appreciate you say 1 seat for every 200, but that, it's very precise. 25% of landscape, that's very precise. Minimum area of 1,200, that's very precise. But when we give a specific size, I think, I would like that.
I think we could add that where it says, 30 feet in one direction, 40 feet in another.
Yeah, or something like that. Whatever.
Again, the slide before you just sort of goes down the list of the requirements that would be in the chapter for courtyards and plazas. We include specific diagrams as well that identify what is being requested or required in this case, whether it be the minimum lot size and dimensions, the amount of landscaping, quality hardscape materials, the trees, the seating, the shade, and lighting. And every publicly accessible open space of a larger size has to have some sort of focal point. So whether it be a water feature or a public art on site, public art is also going to be identified and addressed later on in the next section under community benefits as well, but that there is opportunity to actually include a public art component within the publicly accessible open space. Which brings us to the last chapter under tonight's discussion, which is the community benefits chapter. Previous chapter was called the incentives and bonuses, and it really focused on development bonuses that were granted in exchange for providing things along the lines of additional publicly accessible open space, and that type of bonus and incentive system was found lacking. We have on the screen before you a outline of the existing chapter for the incentives and bonuses, and we have somewhat expanded that chapter, included some of the previous ones in terms of preferred uses, but then we've also introduced a tiered bonus system. So certain uses, as previously in our DSP incentives and bonuses chapter, would still be granted the full maximum development potentials. Those would include affordable housing, historic preservation, hotel uses, and reuse of buildings. So for those type of preferred priority uses in the downtown, they would still be able to obtain the maximum development potential. But then for new residential and commercial projects, there is a new tiered system, and I would like to have Bradley turn this over to discuss this.
So, Vilya, just to understand the previous slide you had, so these uses, they can get the maximum without going through the tier system, basically?
Without the tiered system, yes. These are simply preferred priority uses that receive the full development maximum potential. This would be for the floor area ratio and then for the overall building height.
Okay, so the SB 1818, I guess we have no choice, that's given. But the historic Fine. And the other uses like hotel and reuse, like who came up with that? Is that what staff proposing or?
That is in the current designer, in the current DSP, in the downtown specific plan.
Hotels have been identified as a priority by economic development to attract visitors, to attract those that may patron our businesses and our restaurants. We do maintain that. And that's not to say that they are excluded from all of the standards that we just went through before, and the open space standards still apply. When you participate in the tiered system is when those things start to increase. Before we had the incentive system, and maybe I had a property that allowed a by right FAR of 2.0. I could pursue sustainability and I could add 1.0 FAR, but I still couldn't max out my property because I essentially wasn't allowed to add on multiple incentives to get to the maximum that may have been allowed for that parcel. Also, I think we can pretty much agree that an urban building, a downtown building, is sustainable in its own right. Should we be giving away that much FAR to achieve LEED silver or whatever it may be? The building itself is already being incredibly sustainable. So the thought was to recalibrate these, what were called incentives, to now community benefits. What council has identified and the community have also identified as being important. And the two main ones there are open space and what we're calling a diversity and housing mix. Now with open space, the way we took the by right and we took our maximum FAR, we also plugged in a middle tier as well so you could step your way up. But as you move through this tiered system, if I were to pursue that maximum development potential, I would have to build that publicly accessible open space that we've already required and an additional 2% on top of that. If you get into the larger sites with the larger development potential and the existing open space requirements, you could essentially get up to about 16.5% publicly accessible open space at grade. We'll show in a minute how impactful that could actually be. In terms of the diversity and housing mix, is that council identified that the downtown should not just be accessible and livable just for young singles or young professionals. This should also be a place, this should be a neighborhood at the end of the day, and that those with children or multi-generational family or generational households should also be able to live downtown, to have the type of housing that they need, because we do already offer many of the community services that are needed for those. We have schools directly adjacent to our downtown, we have shops, we have businesses, doctor's office. Everything that you can need is pretty much there. So making sure that our housing stock matches that as well. So as you move through the system, that percentage of housing units that meet those requirements would continually increase. And as you reach that third tier, we would also have some other options in there you could choose from. Public art on site, rather than them just paying into a fund and we let that money sit until we're able to actually achieve some art installations, we would have them produce it on site, create it on site. So it could be, and what that really does is offer an opportunity to have that integrated into the design rather than necessarily plop art installations that tend to fade in the background. We also have priority uses that they could pursue as well to help fulfill that community benefit. But going back to that diversity and housing mix, one of the things we looked at, if we're really trying to attract diverse households, we want households that have children, households that are multi-generational, maybe their grandmother lives with them, maybe it's another relative, is that these units also need to have some certain standards applied to them. Vancouver, BC has been extremely successful in attracting families to live in their urban core and to live in their kind of TOD developments. And that's because they have this minimum requirement and they also have these design standards that apply. That these units that participate in this community benefit program need to be located at a certain place in the building because in the case of children and families, they like to live close to one another. They need, rather than just a bunch of concrete paved courtyards in these buildings, they need playgrounds in there. Maybe they can convert that business center in the apartment buildings that no one ever seems to use at any point in time and turn that into a homework for children or homework room for children. So a number of standards that we've kind of mapped out based on their model and several other cities that have been proven to be successful in how you could create housing for those household types that also makes them want to stay. That our downtown is not just a port of entry for families that may be coming into Glendale, but again, it becomes a neighborhood and they want to live there. There are other things that we identify with council that we as a city, in addition to the DSP, we need to be doing to encourage that, to encourage them to stay. Some of those are just how we convey our resources to households. In Philadelphia, they have a website dedicated specifically for families living downtown. This is where your daycare centers are. This is where your grocery stores are. There are things that we could be doing to help promote that as well. But that's outside of the DSP and other things we would pursue. So lastly, what we did is we wanted to test all of this. As a recovering architect who used to cheat the system every now and then as well, I figured let's see how well this system works. This massing essentially was created from our existing DSP. This is what I could build, and we have buildings that are not all that dissimilar from this right now, sans the detail and the materials. They have flat roof lines. The building separation may be located on the alley side, or even if it's on the street side, it doesn't come down to grade, so it still feels like a large mass for a pedestrian. The sidewalks, we have heard, are too narrow. The balcony projections, some of them hang over, or they just have that tacked-on kind of feeling to the building. The continuous massing and facade, where's the modulation, where's the undulation that occurs? The garage entry, creating conflicts with pedestrians. In many cases, we have some examples that were great. They masked their utilities. They decorated the inside of the walls with maybe art installations or good materials. Others just left the guts exposed. There are these wide mouth openings in the side of buildings. They create conflict with pedestrians, and they're also just not aesthetically pleasing. As we discussed before, these little narrow planters and these little spaces that are concrete paved with maybe a concrete bench have been counting towards open space. So we took our standards and we were essentially able to develop this. The roofline modulation, the requirement that every 150 feet there needs to be some sort of change, combined with that building separation, something that actually comes down to grade, that can also have the publicly accessible open space located in it. Wider sidewalks, so the buildings step back more. The balconies, many of them, I believe we have a certain percentage that requires them to be recessed or partially recessed. Again, kind of playing into that, we need some sort of facade modulation every 50 or 100 feet. The planting at grade, raised planters are fine, but that doesn't need to be all of the landscaping that exists. In this case, we're able to obtain up to 16% of the site as publicly accessible open space. Canopies, we had some standards on there as well.
And still meet the same square footage of the previous.
And actually, right when I bring that home, we'll actually show that there. A lot of elements in here we were trying to fit in. But yes, this building is the exact same height. It's the exact same FAR. In fact, the left side portion is 1 story lower. This goes to the fact that if we remove that stories requirement from this, I can fit more in there. What we were seeing with a lot of these developments were what we were calling the mezzanine levels at the top. And really that was just a loft space. They could have fit a whole other floor of units in there, and we could have claimed some of that ground space back that could have been used for open space or wider sidewalks. So in this case, we were able to maintain that same height. We were just able to slide another story inside. So, and actually going to this diagram here, this is what we were essentially getting. You can see that little notch where we were counting that as open space. And this is how much at-grade space we would be able to obtain, and it's all by sliding that in to the middle floors. 16.5 or 16% of the open space, the wider sidewalks, the planting at grade, the separation occurring at the street. So as you can see in that perspective, it becomes kind of 2 distinct massings depending on your approach to the building. And that was really kind of our test. Like, could this work? Can we still get you the same development potential? Can we still get all the things that council and the community have identified as priorities? You know, that's a lot of information.
So can we go back to, I want to kind of compare that concept to the 2 projects that you started your presentation with on page 3 or page 6 and page 4, which had to do with the massing. So if somebody, if we are trying to tell people to, in order for them to meet this requirement, they need to provide setback, and by giving us the setback, will allow them to go higher to compensate for the massing or the FAR loss that they would have on the ground level. My concern is the scale and the feel of pedestrian, because I think our goal needs to be for pedestrian, right? The feel that you create with a minimal setback by creating a 7-story building or an 8-story building or whatever the case may be, in order for that to feel comfortable for people to walk by, the setback is going to be critical, right? But then comparing to the 2 projects, the hotel and I don't remember what city it was, chapter you started with the massing.
Atlanta.
It was at Atlanta. by creating an arcade, by creating this activities on the ground level and bringing the scale, a human scale to the level, how does that compare to, I mean, if somebody comes and proposes that, is that going to be acceptable? Or do they have to go with such a proposal, whereas they need to push the building in order for them to get the setback? So I just want to understand, because we started looking at some of the great examples that you brought in, and then what I'm afraid of is that with this kind of approach, we're going to get the same result on Central, but then maybe with a 10-foot setback, but the taller buildings. So that's what I'm trying to understand, what we're trying to do.
So the example that we show here, this is actually the exact same height as, too many animations here, as this building here. So this portion to the right is the same height. Again, that's removing that stories requirement. So I believe this was 65 or so. But we're seeing the ability to be able to stack essentially 6 floors of wood on top of 2 floors of concrete, or 7 on top of 1 at this point now. So we kept the height the same. You may see another horizontal line of balconies in there, but the overall massing itself, the height would stay. In terms of these other locations where we did raise the height to 245 feet, the only way they're going to be able to achieve that is to really narrow that up. We had done a number of tests on sites, and that what ends up happening there is we get much more than 16% open space at that point if they were to choose to pursue that. So your setback would be extremely substantial, and the open space in return, especially combined with the design standards, would be. The references we used for Atlanta, we didn't test those two against it. I think what we really wanted to show there is that if we're deliberate and intentional in what we ask for, that we can obtain that. Again, we don't want to design the building for them. In that case in Atlanta, they did not redesign that hotel for them. They just said, look, these are the things that are important to us, and this is what we need from it. So I think with that, we're really just trying to illustrate that we do have the room and the flexibility to ask for improved design.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it?
That it?
Yeah, I think, and last thing, are we still, the projects, are they going to go straight to council, or is it going to be coming to the board or any other review body other than the council?
As of right now, it will remain with council. We're looking at process improvements, which would actually start around the same time that this would wrap up. So maybe there would be some implications there. We're not quite sure, but we're looking at a number of ways to improve overall process for all DRB applications, regardless of neighborhood or district.
I see. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments? Does the Design Review Board have any other comments to the individual board members?
No, thank you.
I like the breakdown. I like the clarity. I like the precise numbering. I think the direction that it's going, it takes out the vagueness and uncertain conditions that we had before, and I think it helps designers to kind of focus more on what the intent is, which overall I think it's a great result.
Yeah, I also want to thank staff. I think this is a great package and a great improvement from what we had previously. The previous version was vague, and a lot of things were left up to the interpretation of the planner and the architect or designer. This is very precise, and I really like and appreciate also all the 3D renderings or models that are put in near each idea, and that makes it easier even for non-designers or non-architects. Like, we look at schedules and we understand it, but once you start putting a 3D rendering like you were presenting earlier, makes it so much easier for all the people that are not professionals in this field. I think it brings and highlights the point we're trying to make, and I think it'll be a great start for architects to start with these diagrams. I mean, this is where you start, and then you advance from there and you work with stuff. So, good job.
Thank you.
Same.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we're done.
Thank you, and we will bring your comments forward to the Planning Commission this coming Tuesday, and then also to City Council again on March the 5th. So we do appreciate that very, very much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the presentation, and we'll go ahead and
We have one set of minutes that need to be approved, and those would be the minutes from January
yeah,
10th.
and we're all here, so
Yes.
I'll take a motion to approve the minutes.
I make a motion to approve the minutes of January 10th.
Second.
I have a motion by Board Member Arzumanian, a second by Board Member Malikian. Board Member Malikian,
Yes.
Board Member Arzumanian,
Yes.
and Chair Benlian.
Yes.
Motion passes to approve the minutes. And with that said, is there a motion to adjourn?
Yes. Motion to adjourn.
Adjourned.
Thank you. Happy
Thank you.
Valentine's Day.